The wind howled along the cliffs of St. Aveline's Point, carrying with it the taste of salt and the whisper of an untold story. The lighthouse stood tall against the storm, its great beam cutting through the darkness like a single, unblinking eye. Inside, Jonathan Hale wound the great brass mechanism by hand, just as he had done every night for the past 20 years. He moved with practiced precision, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Though no ship had passed near St. Aveline's in over a decade, he kept the light burning faithfully. To him, the sea was never truly empty. There were memories in the waves, faces that flickered just beneath the surface, laughter carried in the wind. Jonathan paused by the window, looking down at the raging waters below. The lantern flame shimmered in his eyes. The storm tonight felt different, alive, as though the sea itself was restless. Then, through the spray, he saw something glint on the rocks. A shape. A movement. Grabbing his oil lamp, he descended the spiral staircase and stepped into the roaring night. The rain stung his skin like shards of glass, but he pressed forward, guided by instinct. There, half buried in seaweed and sand, lay a woman. Her hair was tangled with shells, her dress torn by the current. Jonathan knelt beside her and felt a pulse, faint, but there. She was alive. As he turned her over, the beam from the lighthouse swept across her face, revealing delicate features and pale lips that murmured a single word. Jonathan. He froze. How could she know his name? Her fingers trembled as she tried to speak again, but instead, she collapsed against his arm. Around her neck hung a broken silver compass, engraved with 2 letters, JH. Jonathan lifted his gaze toward the merciless sea. The tide crashed harder than ever, but amid the thunder he could swear he heard another sound, an echo of a promise made long ago. He carried the woman back to the lighthouse, unaware that her arrival would awaken the one thing he had tried so long to forget. When Jonathan laid the woman upon the narrow bed in the keeper's quarters, her skin was cold as the sea itself. He lit the fire and covered her with a woolen blanket, the scent of salt and storm still clinging to her hair. For hours she lay still, save for the rise and fall of her breath, fragile as the flicker of the lantern. Jonathan sat nearby, staring at the compass that had fallen from her hand. It was old, the kind used by sailors long before his time. The initials JH gleamed faintly in the firelight, the same as his own. He turned it over, tracing the engraving with a trembling thumb. There, etched beneath the letters, was a phrase barely visible through the tarnish, for when the sea forgets. The words made his stomach tighten. He had heard them once before, whispered in another storm, spoken by someone he had sworn he'd never see again. At dawn, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, clear grey, like morning mist over the water. She looked around, confused, her gaze landing on him with both fear and recognition. "Where am I?" she asked softly. "St. Aveline's Point," Jonathan replied, his voice low. "You were found on the rocks. The tide nearly took you." Her hand went to her neck, finding the missing compass. When she saw it in his palm, her expression changed, relief, then dread. "That belongs to you," she whispered. "Or, it used to." Jonathan frowned. "You know my name, don't you?" She hesitated, as if searching for words she was afraid to say. "I know your voice," she murmured. "I heard it before the waves closed over me." The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady beat of the sea beyond the walls. Jonathan rose, unsettled. "You are unconscious. Perhaps you dreamed." She shook her head faintly. No dream could carry the same sorrow. "You called me Eliza." The name struck him like a blow. It was impossible. Eliza Morphin had been gone for nearly 20 years. He had seen her ship sink beneath the cliffs himself, the light from the lantern catching the wreckage as it disappeared. Yet here she was, her face unchanged, her voice the same as in his memory. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his heart already knew. The woman's lips curved in a sorrowful smile. "You promised you would keep the light burning until I returned," she said. "And you have, Jonathan. The sea kept its word too. It brought me back." The storm outside began to rise again, though no clouds lingered in the sky. And as the lighthouse beam turned slowly across the horizon, its light seemed to catch something in her eyes, something that did not belong to the living. That night, sleep refused to visit Jonathan. The storm had passed, yet the lighthouse groaned as if still remembering the sea's rage. Eliza lay resting in the bed, her breathing steady, but her presence filled the small quarters like a haunting melody. Every creak, every distant sigh of the tide seemed to echo her name. He sat by the fire, the silver compass open in his hand. The needle spun wildly, refusing to point north. It was as though it sought something else, something unseen. Jonathan remembered the day he had given Eliza a compass just like this one. It had been the evening before her ship sailed for France. He had promised to keep the light burning until she returned. But the ship had never reached its destination. The wreckage had washed ashore days later. He had found a piece of her scarf tangled around a fragment of timber. After that night, he never left the lighthouse again. A faint sound stirred him from his thoughts, the slow rhythm of footsteps above. The upper level of the tower was locked. No one had gone up there in years. Grabbing his lamp, Jonathan ascended the spiral staircase, the iron steps moaning under his weight. As he reached the lantern room, the beam of the great lamp swung in slow circles, bathing the sea in golden light. The air felt colder here, heavy with salt and memory. Then he saw it, a wet footprint on the stone floor, gleaming under the lantern's glow. Another appeared, then another, leading toward the glass window that faced the sea. Jonathan followed the trail until it vanished beneath the great brass mechanism. And then, from somewhere deep below, came a sound, low, melodic, almost human. It was a voice, carried through the pipes that ran from the engine room to the tower's heart. He knelt, pressing his ear against the cold metal. The voice was faint but clear. "Jonathan." He stumbled back, nearly dropping the lamp. The voice was hers, Eliza's, calling from the depths beneath the floor. Yet he had left her sleeping in the room below. He hurried down the stairs, the light from his lamp trembling across the walls. The door to the quarters stood open, swinging gently in the draft. The bed was empty. Only the blanket remained, damp and marked with traces of sea salt. Then he saw her, standing by the window, her back to him, the moonlight glinting off the strands of her hair. Her dress hung wet around her ankles, dripping onto the wooden floor. "Eliza," he whispered. She turned slowly, her eyes glimmering like the reflection of the sea. "The tide is calling," she said softly. "It remembers us, Jonathan. It remembers everything we tried to forget." Before he could reach her, a sudden gust blew through the room, extinguishing the fire and his lamp. In the darkness, her form flickered like mist, and when the light returned, she was gone. Only the silver compass remained on the window ledge, its needle pointing, not north, but out toward the open sea. By dawn, the storm clouds had returned, though the wind was strangely still. Jonathan stood at the window, staring at the sea that stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs. The silver compass lay in his palm, its needle quivering as though alive. It no longer pointed toward the horizon but instead tugged faintly toward the base of the lighthouse, as if something there called to it. He could not rest. The memory of Eliza's voice echoed in every breath of air, and her name pulsed through his mind like the steady beat of the tide. He knew she could not be alive, not truly. Yet the chill she left behind was too real to deny. Driven by a mix of dread and longing, Jonathan took his lantern and descended the narrow stairs leading to the lower level, the engine room where the heartbeat of the lighthouse resided. It was a place he had not entered in years, sealed off since the night her ship sank. The door groaned as he forced it open, releasing the smell of rust, oil, and something older, salt and decay. The light from his lantern revealed the machinery, tangled with cobwebs. But in the center of the room lay something unexpected, a wooden chest, warped by dampness, with the initials EM carved into its lid. His breath caught. Eliza Morphin. Kneeling, Jonathan brushed away the dust and pried open the lock. Inside were remnants of the past, a small mirror, a lock of dark hair tied with ribbon, a sailor's map marked with a single red cross along the coast of St. Avelines. And beneath them, wrapped in oilskin, a letter addressed to Jonathan Hale. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but legible. Jonathan. If you are reading this, then the sea has kept its promise. I could not escape it. The night of the storm, our ship turned toward the light. You kept it burning, as you swore you would. But the light drew us not to safety, but to the rocks. Someone changed its course. I saw him at the helm, your brother, Thomas. He meant to claim what we had hidden beneath the lighthouse, the gold from the wreck of the Mariner's Hope. I tried to stop him, but the waves took us both. If the sea returns me, I beg you, set the light right again. Let no more souls be lost to our sin. Jonathan sank back against the wall, the letter slipping from his hand. The truth struck like lightning. He had always believed Eliza's death to be an accident, but now he saw the darkness behind it. His brother, his own blood, had betrayed them both. A low groan rose from beneath the floorboards, followed by a steady drip of water. The tide was coming in fast, but there was no storm outside. The sea was rising from below. He snatched the compass from his pocket. The needle spun once, then stilled, pointing directly toward a crack in the stone wall. The dripping grew louder, turning into a steady pour as seawater began to seep through. Jonathan dropped to his knees, brushing away the loose stone until his fingers struck something cold and metallic, a rusted lever, hidden deep within the foundation. He hesitated only a moment before pulling it. The lighthouse shuddered, a groan of metal and wind echoing through its heart. Somewhere above, the light flared to life, burning brighter than it had in decades. And from the sea came a cry, distant, hollow, yet unmistakably human. It was Eliza's voice, calling once more. The sea roared like a beast unleashed. The storm had broken over St. Aveline's Point with merciless fury. Waves clawed at the cliffs, and the wind howled through the cracks of the lighthouse like the cries of 1,000 ghosts. Jonathan fought to keep the lantern burning, his hands trembling as he climbed the spiral stairs. Below, Eliza struggled to secure the shutters, her hair plastered to her face, her breath short from fear. Every flash of lightning illuminated the walls, the portraits flickered like shadows alive, and the reflection in the mirror did not match her movements. In one terrifying instant, she saw herself standing beside Jonathan at the top of the tower, though she was still below. "Jonathan," she shouted, her voice drowned by thunder. "Something's wrong with the light." He reached the lantern room, breathless. The great lens pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Inside the glass, he saw movement, a flicker of blue light, then the outline of a ship. It wasn't a reflection. It was the Celestine, the ship that had perished 20 years ago, the ship he had failed to save. Eliza joined him, drenched and pale. "It's calling us," she whispered. "I can feel it." The beam swept across the horizon, and for a heartbeat, Jonathan saw faces, sailors reaching out, their eyes hollow with longing. Among them stood a woman, her hair dark as the night sea, her hand lifted toward him. "Eleanor," he breathed. The woman smiled sadly and pointed toward Eliza. The truth crashed upon him like a wave. Eliza was the soul reborn, bound to the promise he had once made to Eleanor before the storm took her life. He had sworn to keep the light burning, to guide her home. And she had returned, not as a ghost, but as a second chance. The lighthouse trembled. The great beam flickered, fading as if the sea itself sought to swallow its light. Jonathan grasped Eliza's hands. "If the light goes out," he said, his voice breaking, "the sea will take everything. We must finish what began that night." Eliza nodded, tears gleaming. Together, they turned the wheel, forcing the lens to align with the storm's heart. The lantern flared, golden and pure, piercing the rain. The sound that followed was not thunder, it was music, soft and distant, the melody of bells beneath the sea. For a moment, the waves stilled. The phantom ship drifted into view, its sails torn, its deck glimmering with ghostly figures. Eleanor stood at the helm, her eyes meeting Jonathan's one last time. The light pulsed once, twice, then steadied. The Celestine faded into the mist, her promise kept at last. Jonathan fell to his knees, the storm easing into a sorrowful calm. Eliza laid a hand upon his shoulder. "She's gone," she murmured. "But so are the shadows." Through the broken clouds, dawn rose pale and soft. The sea lay quiet once more, and the light of St. Aveline's shone upon the waters, steadfast, eternal. Jonathan turned to Eliza, his heart aching yet unburdened. "The light was never meant for the ships alone," he said quietly. "It was meant for us, to find our way back." The wind whispered around the tower, carrying with it the faintest echo of Eleanor's laughter. The keeper's promise had been fulfilled. And the lighthouse, for the first time in 20 years, stood bathed in peace. The years that followed the storm were quiet along St. Aveline's Point. The cliffs, once battered and haunted, now stood washed in soft sunlight, and the sea, though never fully tamed, seemed gentler, as if the old spirits had finally found rest beneath its waves. Jonathan Hale no longer climbed the tower each night with trembling hands. He did so with reverence, lighting the great lantern not for the ships that seldom passed, but for the memory of those who once sailed by its glow. Eliza often joined him, her laughter echoing through the stairwell, turning the cold stone walls into something alive once more. The people of Whitby began to whisper again of the old lighthouse. Not with fear, but with a kind of wistful affection. They said that its light no longer warned of danger, but offered guidance to the lost. Fishermen claimed that, on misty evenings, they could see a faint outline of a woman standing beside the beam, watching the sea with peaceful eyes. One afternoon, as the tide rolled in golden under the setting sun, Eliza found Jonathan sitting outside the keeper's cottage, his journal open upon his lap. His hair had turned silver, his face lined not with grief but with years of weather and wisdom. "You still write to her," Eliza said softly, sitting beside him. He smiled faintly. "Old habits," he murmured. "The sea may forget, but I cannot." Eliza glanced at the journal. The pages were filled with sketches, maps of stars, drawings of ships, and a name written over and over again, Eleanor Vale. "She was my promise," Jonathan said, closing the book. "But you were my redemption." The waves lapped gently against the rocks below. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and heather. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment, neither spoke. The lighthouse hummed behind them, its steady beam sweeping the dusk. Years passed, as they always do. Jonathan grew old, and one crisp morning, as gulls wheeled above the cliffs, he failed to rise from his chair by the window. The light still burned that night, though no one had gone up to tend it. When Eliza climbed the tower, she found the lantern room aglow, and in the reflection of the glass, she saw him, standing tall beside the beam, smiling. He raised a hand, as if in farewell. "Eliza," his voice seemed to whisper through the turning gears, "keep the light burning." And then, like the tide that returns to the sea, he was gone. Eliza stayed at St. Aveline's, as Jonathan once had. She became the keeper of the light, its guardian, its heart. Each evening, she wrote in his journal, recording not the passing of ships, but the passing of time. She spoke to the sea as if it listened, and sometimes, on the stillest nights, she heard laughter in the wind, his, and perhaps Eleanor's too. When visitors came to Whitby, they often asked about the light that never faded, even through storms. The villagers would tell them the story of Jonathan Hale, the keeper who made a promise to the sea, and of the woman who kept that promise alive. And if one stood by the cliffs at midnight, watching the lantern turn, one might just see two figures in the glow, hand in hand, gazing out toward the horizon. Because at St. Aveline's Point, the light never truly belonged to the living or the dead. It belonged to the promise between them. Months passed quietly at St. Aveline's Point. Eliza had settled fully into her role as keeper of the light. The village grew accustomed to her presence, though few dared to approach the cliffs at night. Those who did often spoke of a strange calm that seemed to settle over the waters, as though the lighthouse itself was breathing. One evening, while recording the day's observations in Jonathan's journal, Eliza noticed something unusual. The silver compass lay on the table, its needle trembling, pointing not to the horizon but toward the sea itself. A chill ran down her spine. She rose and stepped onto the balcony, the wind carrying the scent of salt and storm. The moon hung low, silvered and vast, casting long shadows across the cliffs. From beneath the waves came a faint glow, ethereal, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Eliza watched, breathless, as shapes began to emerge from the water. Ghostly figures, perhaps sailors long lost, glided across the surface, their faces serene yet unreadable. A familiar voice whispered on the wind. "Eliza." She spun, but no one was there. Only the lighthouse, standing steadfast against the darkness. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time, emanating from the compass itself. "Keep the light burning," it said. "The sea never forgets those who honor it." Eliza clutched the compass. In that moment, she understood, the sea's spirits were still watching, still guided by the beacon she tended. Jonathan's presence lingered in the warmth of the tower, in the soft pulse of the lantern. And Eleanor, somewhere between past and present, remained tied to the promise that had begun decades ago. That night, Eliza did not sleep. She kept the lantern burning high, the silver compass before her, its needle steady. Outside, the waves whispered their ancient songs, and though the lighthouse cast light over the darkness, it was clear that the sea still held its secrets, mysterious, eternal, and never fully revealed. And somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the echoes of Jonathan and Eleanor drifted, carried by the tides, reminding her, and the world, that some promises can never fade. Several weeks after Jonathan's passing, Eliza maintained the lighthouse alone. The villagers had grown used to seeing the light shining across the cliffs, steady through the calmest nights and fiercest storms alike. One evening, as the sun sank behind a violet horizon, Eliza noticed the silver compass vibrating lightly on the table. Its needle quivered, pointing once more toward the sea. A strange feeling rose in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and unease. She ascended the spiral stairs to the lantern room, the lantern swinging lightly in the evening breeze. The wind carried whispers, faint voices she could not fully understand. She listened closely. "Promise, keep it, wait." The words were familiar, yet not quite Jonathan's or Eleanor's. The beam of the lighthouse flickered, catching something moving far off in the waters. A shadow of a ship, smaller than before, drifted silently over the waves. Eliza leaned closer to the glass, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw two figures standing on the deck, a man and a woman, their forms blurred by distance and mist. The compass pointed unwaveringly at them. A shiver ran down her spine. The sea was speaking again, sending a reminder that the world beneath the waves still held secrets, promises, and perhaps unfinished stories. Eliza exhaled slowly and adjusted the lantern. "I will wait," she whispered. "I will keep the light burning. Until you return, whoever you are." And as the wind carried her words across the dark waters, the lighthouse's beam cut a golden path, unwavering and eternal. The night was silent, yet alive with expectation.